I'm going to look at two areas in this debate. First, which side best upholds the principles of democracy? Second, which side best upholds democracy in practice? And I'm going to show you that on both these accounts, it's Team Singapore that have taken this debate. Let's go to the first point of contention. Which side of the House best upholds the principles of democracy? Before I begin, I'd just like to point out that on this point, my first speaker's first substantive, how every right given to you involves both a positive right and a negative right, has went completely untouched by their side of the House. He told you that giving a right to someone means giving them the ability not to exercise this right as well. He gave you examples from freedom of speech to freedom of movement and said this applies as well to the right to vote. If you have a right to vote, you have a right not to vote as well. This analysis has gone completely untouched by their side of the House. We think we take it on this point. But let's take it one step further and listen to some of the rebuttals they did make to our case. Now, the first rebuttal they made to their case was this, that essentially a blank vote is exactly the same as not turning up to the polls. Okay, I'll take you.
So, if you realize that at the end of the day, after you go through other democratic tool, petition or protest, if voter apathy is still there, your next election is not going to reflect anything.
If you wait a while, I'll be telling you why forcing voters to go to the polls is only going to make them even more apathetic. Worse still, it's going to make them resentful at the government that's forced them to go to the polls. This is what my second speaker told you, and we don't think you've managed to answer his point sufficiently. So let's go back to my point of contention. So I'm going to tell you right now why there is a very big difference between a blank vote and a decision to not even turn up. We've told you this from our first speaker and our second speaker, but let's illustrate this to make this a little bit clearer. Let's say I belong to a hypothetical nation, say a very pleasant but slightly smaller northern nation which has been oppressed for hundreds of years by a larger, evil southern nation. And I happen to live in that country, and you know, I feel very angry at the entire political system as a whole. What's the difference then between casting a blank vote and not turning up to the polls at all? Casting a blank vote means I have to walk down to the polling station, stand under the flag of a nation I disagree with, sign my name on the voting register and says, I take part in this election. I legitimize this government I disagree with. I may just be there to cast a blank vote, but the fact that I've even turned up means I legitimize the government, its system of election, and that's why we think a blank vote is very different from not turning up at all. No thank you, man. But let's assume, for an instance, that they managed to rebut this analysis. Even if we accept that there is no difference between a blank vote and an abstention, a blank vote and not turning up at all, we tell you, then that means a lot of their case doesn't hold at all. Why? They told us that blank votes allow governments, to understand the electorate better. Because if you have 90% of people voting for you and 10% of people casting blank votes, then you know 10% of people aren't interested in politics. Hang on, but if blank votes are exactly the same as people not turning up to vote as well, then doesn't that mean that the government will get the exact same message? Instead of 90% people voting and 10% people casting blank votes, it'll just be 90% people turning up to the polls and 10% people not turning up, which means that they get the exact same message, that 10% of the population isn't interested in politics at all. So even if we accept their arguments that a blank vote and not turning up are exactly the same, they defeat their own arguments about giving governments better information by it. Let's go on to the next argument. They seem to be laboring under this assumption that a larger mandate is necessarily a better mandate. If we get 90% of people to turn up to the polls, that means we're a better government than if we only got 80% or 50%. But that fails to consider what my second speaker told you. He said the mandate is pointless if the mandate is only there because you forced people to turn up. In fact, I'm going to take this one step further and suggest this is really insidious. Because then the government thinks, oh hey guys, we're doing things fine, people may not have voted for us, but at least they're interested in politics, they're still turning up for elections. It's only when you don't have the system of forcing people to go to polls in the first place that the government will begin to realize, damn, we're doing something wrong. We need to get people more interested in politics. And this is where we totally agree with what they've been saying. It's the responsibility of the government and the political parties to get you interested in politics. They shouldn't force you to become interested in politics. They should go out to you, reach out to you and tell you why you should be interested in politics. We think it's insulting that they can suggest that voters should be forced to vote even if they don't want to. It's the responsibility of those politicians we are paying with our tax money to get us interested in politics, not suddenly a civic responsibility upon my part. So we think on the principle of democracy, they have failed this debate. The last argument which they tried to extend in their third speaker is this really strange parallel to compulsory education. They say, well, we can make education compulsory, so I guess that means we can make voting compulsory as well. No, We make education compulsory because it's good for you that you go and become educated. You gain no benefit from being dragged out of your bed at 10 a.m. in the morning when you don't want to go and vote, and to cast a vote that you didn't even want to cast in the first place. If you had voluntarily got out of bed to express your own opinions, we think that's fine. But forcing you to get out of bed and vote does no benefit for you whatsoever. We reject their point. So let's go on to my next point of contention. Which side best benefits democracy in practice? And here, I'll be dealing with the point of information raised earlier about apathy. They told us it's a really bad thing that voters become apathetic, about the entire political system. And we suggest that the apathy is only going to get worse, if the political system, rather than just being something that they don't care about, becomes something that actively compels them to do things they don't want. They told us so much about the opportunity cost of going to vote, what you have to give up to go and vote. And we tell you, yes, it's precisely that opportunity cost that you force people to go through that makes them angry, that makes them resentful, that makes them cast votes for parties like the British National Party or the One Nation Party in Australia, which are racist and extremist and against the system as a whole. So if you care about democracy in practice, then you should go with our side of the house. This is what my second speaker told you. Can you rebut it now, ma'am?
If you don't like that particular government, tell me how staying at home in your bed at 10 in the morning will change anything with that
Because when
process.
they look at the numbers and realize only 50% of people even bother to come to the polling stations at all, it's a huge message. There's something wrong with the country. I'm telling them, I dislike you so much, I'm not even willing to take the few short steps from my house to the polling station because that's how much I disagree with you and your politics. So that's a very important message, madam. Don't you forget it. Let's go back to my point of contention right now on the practicals of democracy. They seem to suggest that all other forms of political expression aren't as good as voting, because voting somehow involves a large opportunity cost. I've dealt with this earlier, but let me give you another rebuttal right now. We tell you that every single other form of democratic opinion represents an opportunity cost too. I mean, arguably participating in a protest involves far more opportunity cost than going to vote, because you might get arrested, you have to spend even more time standing in the hot sun with a placard. So if your criteria is only on opportunity cost, we tell you, we take this point as well. But most importantly, they haven't rebutted what my second speaker said about minorities. He told them that if they are really concerned about minorities, then it's actually compulsory voting that makes the minority voice completely drowned out. Let's give you a simple example. In America, the African American community is relatively small, but they're incredibly important swing voters because all of them bother to turn up for elections in the first place. That's why governments pay close attention to the policies and the wants of the African American community, which is of a far greater extent than to their numbers as a total percentage of America's population. If, as my second speaker said, you enforce compulsory voting, then these minority voices get completely drowned out. We think that if you care about minorities in practice, you have to go with our side of the house as well. So because I've shown you that they let democracy down, both in principle and in practice, go with side opposition.